For more than 30 years, one of the finest minds in Europe, the philosopher Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, believed his mother was a glazier's wife. He was wrong. His real mother was Claudine de Tencin, and on a freezing November dawn in 1717, she carried him, hours old, to the stone step of a small church beside Notre Dame, laid him down, and walked into the dark without looking back a second time. She would go to her grave swearing he was not her son. She had drawn the cloth back once, in the blue cold, to look at the small, sleeping face. She did not look again. One tiny hand had worked itself free of the wrapping, a bare fist no bigger than a walnut, open against the gray stone. She could not make herself cover it, and she did not stop to ask herself why. Consider what she was carrying down to that step. Not merely a child, proof. Proof of an affair. Proof of a secularized nun who had gone from the choir stall to an officer's bed inside a few short years. Proof of everything the great houses of Paris would need to bury a woman of no rank forever. And behind the small sleeping face, a scandal that could put her back behind convent walls for the rest of her natural life. Whether she ever tried to take him back, whether the boy ever once let her come near, is the whole of what follows. And the answer would cost her more than the cloister ever had. So she chose the stone. Understand her before you judge the choosing. The church was Saint-Jean-le-Rond, a small thing crouched against the flank of the cathedral, so close it seemed to lean on Notre Dame for warmth. The bells had not yet rung, the river lay to their left under a skin of mist, and the cold came off the stone of the quay in a way that got into the bone and stayed there. A city of 500,000 souls slept around them, and not one of them, God willing, was awake at the right window. Ursule Charnier held the lantern. She had held worse for this woman across 20 years, since the convent days, and she held the light steady now only because her hands had long forgotten how to shake in front of Tencin. The flame guttered in the river air. Somewhere behind the shuttered houses a dog complained once and thought better of it. You can still keep him. Ursule said it low, the way you say a thing you already know is lost. There are women who would help. A house in the country. No one need ever know. Everyone would know. Tencin did not turn her head. Everyone always knows. That is the whole trouble with everyone. There was a system for this, and Tencin knew it the way she knew everything. Exactly. The parish took in what the parish could not feed. A child could be left at the tour, and a numbered ticket pinned to the swaddling cloth and entered in a register, so that in theory, a mother who mended her fortune might come back one day, name the number, and reclaim what she had set down. In theory. She had the ticket already. She had been turning the ticket over in her fingers for a long time. The bundle weighed almost nothing and weighed the world. She had wrapped him herself in the small hours, tight, the way the nuns at Montfleury had once taught her to wrap the newly dead for the ground, because those were the only small, still bodies the convent had ever put into her arms. She carried him the last 20 steps herself. She did not hurry. Hurrying is what the guilty do, and she had decided long ago not to be guilty, only quick. She knelt, and the cold of the step came straight up through her skirts, and she set him down on the stone. Then she drew the cloth back from his face. He slept. One hand had worked itself free of the wrapping somewhere in the night and lay open against the gray stone, fingers half curled, the little fist bare to the November air. She pinned the ticket to the cloth. She drew the wrapping back up to his chin, and no further because she found she could not make herself cover the small, bare fist, and she did not stop to ask herself why. She stood. And then Claudine de Tencin turned her back on her son and walked, and she stepped into the black mouth of the street, and the mist closed over the place where she had been. By full light, the whole parish knew a child had been left before the first bell. It was not remarkable. In that Paris, a foundling on a church step was a half-official act, cruel and ordinary and entirely within the law, complete with its ticket and its register and its clerk. The mother, of course, was the last thing anyone thought to look for. The monster of this story is not the woman who set the child down. It is the arrangement that made setting him down the reasonable thing to do. To understand a woman who could do that, you have to go back 19 years and far to the south, to the convent of Montfleury outside Grenoble, and to a girl of 16 who did not want to be a nun and was going to be one regardless of what she wanted. The Tencins were a family of the robe, respectable, ambitious, provincial, and short of the coin to marry off every daughter as a daughter of that name ought to be married. Claudine was one daughter too many for the sum available. Her father had put the arithmetic to her without softening it. She would take the veil, or he would have her shut up all the same, between four walls, where a disobedient girl of good family could be filed away and forgotten by a single stroke of a father's will. It was not a threat in that France, it was a procedure. So in 1698, she knelt in the choir at Montfleury and professed her vows, 16 years old, and swore poverty and chastity and obedience before God and her family and the indifferent stone. She meant not one syllable of it. She said every syllable of it perfectly. That gift for saying perfectly a thing she did not mean would carry her the whole rest of her life, and it began there, in a cold choir, at 16. Here the popular picture of the thing goes simply wrong. A nun's vows were thought a sentence for life, the door shut, and the key dropped in the river. Hers were not. What Rome had bound, Rome could unbind, for the right petition pressed by the right hands with the right patience. And Claudine de Tencin spent 10 years pressing. Letters that went nowhere and were written again. Advocates paid and prodded. The vast, slow machinery of the church ground upon daily by a woman who had decided she would outlast it. In 1712, the paper came at last. A papal secularization, a brief under seal, releasing her from the cloister into the open world at the age of 30. Freedom was a thing one could purchase, provided one had 10 years to spend, and no shame at all about the spending. She had bought hers outright. She walked out of Montfleury with her own name and very little else, and she went to Paris, because for a woman like that, there was nowhere else on earth to go. And Paris in those years belonged to appetite. The old king was 5 years in his tomb. The new king was a child of 7, and Philippe d'Orléans ruled as regent from the Palais Royal over a court that had flung off a lifetime of Versailles piety and meant quite openly to enjoy the throwing. Suppers ran late. Fortunes turned on a glance. Into a world like that, a secularized ex-nun with a sharp, watchful face and no money at all could rise very high, or drown very fast, and often both. She met an artillery officer named Louis Camus d'Estouches. There was an affair, conducted in the discreet manner such things demanded, and there was, in the small hours of a November, a consequence. The officer, as officers are, was away with his regiment. The consequence was hers alone. This was the ledge she lived on then, every waking hour. A provincial girl from a bishop's rank house in Grenoble, an ex-nun, no husband, no rank the Palais Royal would trouble to recognize, and now carrying a stain any great lady could smell clear across a crowded room. Set against her, the whole gilded world she was determined to enter, the regent's intimates, the rising churchmen, the men who moved France with a word dropped at a card table. The child on the stone was the single piece of evidence that could hold her outside all of it, permanently, and she knew the exact weight of it in her arms. So the bare fist against the gray stone was not the act of a woman with no heart. It was the act of a woman who had already burned 10 years buying her way out of one cage and did not intend to be locked into a second by an infant she could never once explain in the drawing rooms she meant to conquer. Cruel, certainly, cold, certainly, but she had done her sums in the choir at Montfleury as well, and not once in her life had the sums come out kind. She had plans a child would have strangled in the cradle. A younger brother, the Abbé de Tencin, clever and hungry and entirely hers to push, whom she meant to lift as high as the church would let a man be lifted, with a determined sister at his back. She had spent 35 years learning one lesson to the bone. A woman of no rank in France owned no power of her own, none, and could lay hold only of the power that some man would lend her, through his favor, or his ear, or his bed. And so that same winter, Claudine de Tencin turned her sharp and watchful face toward the one door in all of Paris that might open for a woman built like her, the Palais Royal. The ear, and in the fullness of time the bed, of the man who ruled France in the child king's name. Standing near him already, rising quietly, was a shrewd and patient priest named Dubois, soon to be a cardinal, soon to be master of the whole kingdom in everything but the crown. Tencin marked them both, the regent and his churchman, the way a good player marks the two cards that will win the table. She was 35. She was free at last of the vows, free of the convent, free even of the child. She was clever past the point of mercy, and she was ready. She had made herself free of the one thing the world could ever have used to chain her. She had left it on a stone step before the bells rang and walked cleanly into the dark, her ledger squared, her future finally her own. What she did not understand, walking away that morning with everything so neatly balanced, was that the small, bare fist would not stay on the step where she had laid it. It would grow. It would grow into a man and into one of the finest minds in all of Europe. And when at last it reached back for her, it would come from the single direction she had never once thought to guard. 3 years on, the candles at the Palais Royal ran to their sockets and were replaced without anyone rising from the table. The supper had begun near midnight and had every intention of forgetting the hour. There was wine from the regent's own cellars. There was a duchess laughing too loudly at something a fermier général had murmured. And there, near the middle of the long table where the real weight of the room had quietly gathered itself, sat a woman of no rank at all, watching everything and eating almost nothing. Claudine de Tencin was near 40 now, and the sharp, watchful face had learned to smile while it counted. It counted well. She had come into this room 5 years earlier as an ex-nun with a fortune of debts and a brother to place, and she sat in it now because she had found the one currency a woman of no birth could spend, and had spent it without a tremor, and with her eyes open the entire time. The currency was a priest. Guillaume Dubois, risen from nothing himself, tutor turned schemer turned first minister, the shrewdest and least scrupulous head in France, who governed the whole kingdom in the regent's easy name and who was, the winter of 1720, entirely and usefully in love with her. Paris found the pairing delicious. An ex-nun and a cardinal in waiting, the two of them climbing the same greasy rope hand over hand, and neither pretending it was anything but the climb. She had chosen him the way a good player chooses a card. Not the handsomest man at the table, not the kindest. The one who took the trick. "You are not laughing at the Duke's story," Dubois said to her once, low, in the cabinet where the ministerial papers of France lay in their calfskin folders across a table longer than a barge. Everyone laughed. Everyone laughed because you were watching to see who would not. Tencin did not look up from the pension list she had drawn toward herself without being invited. "I would rather you watched me for a better reason. That pension list was the true romance of the age, and she read it the way other women read verses. Names, and beside each name a sum drawn on the king's revenue, and the whole slow traffic by which a signature became a living. She had a brother on it now. The Abbé de Tencin, clever and cold and hungry as she was hungry, whom she was lifting hand over hand through the church, exactly as she and her cardinal were lifting themselves. An abbacy here, a fat benefice there, the promise of a mitre held out in the middle distance like sugar to a good horse. She meant to make him a bishop. She meant, in the end, to make him what Dubois was. She said so to no one but Ursule, and she said it flatly as a plan, not a dream. And all around this quiet arithmetic, the city had gone mad for paper. John Law, the Scot, had built his system, and the Mississippi Company's shares had climbed to the moon, and half the great names of France had mortgaged land older than the monarchy to buy printed promises of Louisiana gold. Footmen had become millionaires between a Monday and a Thursday. Dukes queued in the Rue Quincampoix. The word millionaire itself was minted new in those months. For a thing there had not before been enough of anything to need a word for. Tencin bought in. Of course she bought in. She was not a fool, and there was a fortune lying in the street for the quick. But she watched the paper the way she watched the room, and somewhere in the high delirium of 1720, while the dukes were still buying, she began quietly to sell. Land she took and metal and a house, the dull, solid things the clever laughed at that season. She turned her mountain of Mississippi paper back into the coin of a duller, older world, and she did it early. And she did it without saying why. By the autumn, the system came down like a shot deer. The paper that had bought a duchy on Monday would not buy a candle on Friday. Men who had been millionaires in the spring walked the same Rue Quincampoix in the winter with nothing in their hands and a great deal of very fine paper in their pockets. There was a certain Duke de something, a name old enough to have ridden with a crusade, who had put the whole of his house into the shares near the top and came out the far side owning debts and a title and nothing you could eat. Tencin heard of his ruin at a supper very like this one. She was sorry, she said. She was, a little. She had pulled the better part of her own fortune out of the fire 2 seasons before he thought to reach for the door, and she knew precisely why she was dry while he was drowning. And it was not luck, and she did not call it luck. The sums, for once in her life, had come out kind. She noticed that they had. She did not entirely trust it. Everyone at the Palais Royal knew what she was and traded with her regardless, because she was useful, and because the useful are forgiven everything in a court until the day they are useful no longer. She wore the cardinal's regard openly, a card face up on the table, and she let the old blood of France sniff at her provincial name and her secularized vows and her purchased fortune, and she smiled while they sniffed, and she placed her brother one benefice higher every year, a woman of no rank, governing the men who governed France. Through the one door they had left carelessly open, she thought she had found the whole secret of the world. She was very nearly right, which is the most dangerous thing a clever person can be. And then there were the evenings the arithmetic stopped. It happened on the Ile de la Cité, on an afternoon of low gray light in the early part of the year, when her carriage was made to halt near the cathedral by a press of carts. She was not thinking of anything in particular. She was thinking of the abbé's next benefice, and of a letter Dubois wanted worded a certain careful way. And through the carriage glass, across a stretch of wet stone, she saw the little church that leaned against the great one, Saint-Jean-le-Rond, crouched under the flank of Notre Dame. She had not meant to look at it. One never means to. There was a woman on the step with a basket, and in the basket, wrapped, something small. A nurse from the foundling house, most likely, going about the ordinary parish traffic in abandoned children, of which there was a great deal, all of it legal, all of it filed. The bundle in the basket had worked one hand free of its wrapping, a small, bare fist, open to the cold air, against the woman's dark sleeve. Tencin sat very still. She had kept the number. That was the thing she had never told even Ursule, that in a small enameled box among her rings, there was a scrap with a number on it, the number of a ticket pinned to a swaddling cloth on a November dawn 6 years gone, the number by which, in theory, a mother who had mended her fortune might come to a certain clerk and name a certain child and take him back into the world under her own roof. She had mended her fortune. She had mended it past anything that November mother could have dreamed. The clerk was a walk of 10 minutes from where her carriage now stood. Madame, Ursule, across from her, had followed her eyes to the step and then brought them carefully back. Shall I tell him to find another street? For the length of one held breath, Claudine de Tencin, who could balance any account in France, sat with an account she could not make come right. On the one side, a boy she had never seen awake, 6 years old now, somewhere in the city, her own blood, the single warm thing her cold life had ever made. On the other side, everything. Her name in the drawing rooms, her brother's mitre, the cardinal who could forgive a mistress a great many things, but could not be handed, at the height of his own careful climb, a bastard out of a foundling register. The sums did not balance. They had never once, in her whole life, come out kind on the side of the child, and she had known that on the step, and she knew it now. Another street, Ursule. Her voice did not change at all. That was the terrible part. It did not change. She turned the little enameled box over once in her gloved fingers, the way you touch a bruise to be sure it is still there. And then she put her hand back in her lap, and the carriage found its way clear of the carts, and she went to the supper she was expected at. And she was, everyone agreed, in wonderful form that night. The box went back among the rings. The number stayed on its scrap. She had almost done something. On the Ile de la Cité, in the gray light, she had not. Everyone always knows, she had told Ursula once, on a colder morning. It was the one thing she had been wrong about. Nobody knew this. She carried it out of the parish entirely alone, and she meant to carry it to the grave. She would. Then the year came that took the ground out from under her, and it took it all at once. In the summer of 1723, Guillaume Dubois died. The cardinal, the first minister, the whole architecture of her standing in the world, gone in a matter of days. An old body finally presenting its bill for a lifetime of appetite. She had known he was failing. She had not let herself count what his death would cost, because it was the one sum she did not wish to see the answer to. Now she saw it. Her lover was dead, and with him died the reason the Palais Royal had troubled to smile at a bishop's family daughter from Grenoble. She had barely finished recalculating when the second blow fell in the same terrible season. Philippe d'Orléans, the regent himself, the man in whose easy name the whole game had been played, dropped dead by his own fireside before the year was out, worn through at 49. Within a few short months, the two men whose favor had been her entire fortune, the priest who loved her and the prince who tolerated her, were both under stone. And Claudine de Tencin stood in the middle of Paris exactly as she had once stood in the middle of that November dawn, alone, with a great deal of property, and no protector on this earth. The circling began almost before the funerals were cold. The Marquise de Vaugirard led it, quietly, from behind a fan. She was old blood, the real thing, the kind of name that had been at Fontenay when the Tencins were still counting sous in Grenoble, and she had a contempt for Claudine de Tencin that was not, if one is honest, entirely without its point. Here was a nun who had bought her way out of her vows and climbed into a cardinal's bed and grown rich on paper while better people drowned, and who was whispered, in the very lowest rooms, to have left her own child on a stone in the cold. Vaugirard did not know that last for true. She did not need it true. She began, with great discretion, to pay for the pamphlets, and the pamphlets began to appear, and into this exposed and narrowing moment walked Charles Joseph de la Fresnaye, who loved her, and whom she had, in her fashion, loved back. He was everything Dubois had not been: young, charming, well-born, and weak all the way through. A gentleman who could not pass a card table without sitting down at it, and could not sit down at it without losing. He had been losing for a long time, and somewhere in the good years, trusting her cold head as men trusted it right up until it closed against them. He had signed the better part of what remained of his fortune into her name. For safekeeping, he said, against his own worst habits. It had seemed sensible. She was the surest banker in Paris. She kept what she was given. His cousin held the rest of his paper, and the cousin was not sentimental. Godefroy de Renoncourt had La Fresnaye's markers to a sum that would finish him, and Renoncourt wanted his money, cousin or no cousin, and he was pressing the debt now with the particular patience of a man who knows the vice turns only one way. La Fresnaye came to Tencin's rooms in the lean years that followed the two deaths, and he was not charming the day he came. He was gray. He asked her plainly, with his hat turning in his hands like a boy's, to give it back. What he had put in her name. It was his last ground. Renoncourt would take everything else. If she returned what she held, he could stand, he could pay, he could live. "Save me, Claudine," he said. "You are the only one who can. You have only to sign it back." And Claudine de Tencin, who did her sums, looked at the man she loved as much as she loved anyone, and did them. Her protector was dead. Her second protector was dead. Vaugirard's pamphlets were on the stalls. She was a woman alone with a fortune and a swarm of enemies, and not one man left standing between her and them. And the property he had signed into her name was, now, a wall she could not spare from around her own house. If she gave it back, she gave away a piece of the only thing keeping her upright in a city that had begun, quietly, to want her ruined. She said no. She said it gently, which was worse. She spoke of law, and of the form of the thing, and of how it was, after all, in her name now, and could not simply be unsaid, and of how he would find his feet. He always found his feet. Every word of it was reasonable. Every word of it was correct by the only arithmetic she had ever been taught, in a cold choir, at 16, by people who had shut her up for the crime of costing too much. And every word of it was the act of the woman the pamphlets already said she was, so that for one moment, in her own warm and candlelit room, Claudine de Tencin watched herself become the exact thing Paris was paying to call her, and she did not stop. La Fresnaye stopped turning his hat. That was the first strange thing. His hands went still, and his gray face smoothed out, and something behind his eyes that had been thrashing for weeks simply lay down and was quiet. He looked at her almost with tenderness. He thanked her, which no one thanks the person who has just refused them, and he said it softly, and he meant it, and that was the thing that frightened her later when she had leisure to be frightened. "You have always been honest with me," he said. "You are being honest now. I shan't trouble you again." He bowed to her the way he had bowed the first night they met, correct and light and complete. Then Charles Joseph de la Fresnaye put on his hat and walked out of her rooms with the settled calm of a man who has finally, after a long time lost, worked out exactly where he is going, and the door closed behind him without a sound. Tencin stood a long while in the candlelight after he had gone. She could not have said what was wrong. Everything had gone as her arithmetic required. The account was balanced, the wall around her house was whole. She had done nothing that any careful person would not have done in her place. And yet she found she was cold, in a warm room, the way she had been cold once on a stone step before the bells, and she could not make that sum come right either. The shot came just past 10 in the evening, and it was so loud in the closed house that, for one breath, every clock in it seemed to stop. Then a girl in the scullery began to scream, and did not stop, and the sound of her ran up the back stairs ahead of everything else, so that the whole house knew a terrible thing before a single soul knew what it was. Tencin was at her writing table when it came. She rose without deciding to rise. Somewhere under the ordinary alarm of it, in the oldest and coldest part of her, a thing she had no name for had already sat up and begun, quietly, to be afraid. She went down the small passage toward the back parlor, and the servants fell away from her on either side the way water falls from a prow. And the screaming girl is in the doorway with both hands over her mouth now, and past her, in the candlelight of a room Tencin used for nothing in particular, Charles Joseph de la Fresnaye sat back in a chair, as though he had merely fallen asleep in the middle of a thought. He had not fallen asleep. The pistol had done its plain and dreadful work, and there was no charm left in the face at all, only the gray stillness she had seen in it once before, in her own warm room, when he had thanked her for refusing him, and gone out with the settled calm of a man who has worked out where he is going. He had gone here. He had come back into her house to do it. That was the first thing she understood standing in the doorway, and it went into her like the cold coming up through her skirts on a stone step long ago. The second thing she understood was on the table. There was a folded letter beside his hand. It had been placed, not dropped, and across the fold, in his own hand, gone slightly awry at the end the way a hand goes when it is doing the last thing it will ever do, was written a name. Her name. Not his cousin's, not a priest's, not God's. Hers. She did not go to it at once. She stood in the doorway of her own back parlor, and she looked at the letter with her name on it. And she did her sums, there, over the body of a man she had loved as much as she loved anyone. And the sums come out in one direction only, and it was the direction of the pit. He had made his death a sentence, and he had made her the accused, and he had signed the indictment across the fold in the last ink of his life, so that no one in Paris would ever be able to unsee it. "Fetch no one yet," she said to the room. Her voice did not shake. It never shook, which was the thing that would be held against her more than anything, later, by people who thought grief had a proper volume. Ursule, only Ursule, but the house had already broken open. Somewhere below, a door had gone into the street, and the screaming girl had done her work, and a city that slept lightly and gossiped in its sleep had begun, from the very first minute, to lean toward her house and listen. There was a knock at the street door. It was not a servant's knock. It was the flat, unhurried, official knock of a hand that knows the door will be open. And Claudine de Tencin, standing over the letter with her name on it, heard it and understood that the night was already no longer hers. By the gray of the morning, Paris had its story, and Paris, having a story, wanted no better one. The tale ran the length of the city before the body was cold. A gentleman of good name ruined, dead by a pistol in the house of the woman who held his fortune, with her name on a letter beside his hand. It told itself. It needed no help. But it got help regardless, because grief and greed had come to the same door and could no longer be told apart. And his name was Godefroy de Renancourt. Renancourt had lost a cousin and a great deal of money in the same hour, and he did not pretend to himself or anyone that he could separate the two. He came to the Châtelet with his grief in his hands like a writ. She held Charles Joseph's fortune, signed into her name. Charles Joseph had gone to her to beg it back, everyone knew it, and she had refused him, and days later he was dead on her floor. Whether her hand or her coldness had held the pistol, said Renancourt, was a distinction he would leave to cleverer men. The woman had emptied his cousin out and then locked the door. And a man does not put a ball in his brain in the house of a friend. And here's the terrible grain of it that no honest telling can leave out. He was not wholly wrong. She had held the fortune. She had refused him gently, correctly, with law in her mouth, on an afternoon when she chose the wall around her own house over the man in front of her. By her own cold arithmetic, she had a hand in his despair, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her through everything that followed and did not once get up and leave. Then the pamphlets went to work, and the pamphlets had a knife the courts did not. Léonard Griset was a hack of the lowest sort, a man who would print anything for the coin that paid the press, and the coin that season came discreetly through 3 hands from the Marquise de Vaugirard, who had waited a very long time for exactly this and did not intend to waste it. Griset's sheets did not trouble with the fortune or the letter. Griset's sheets asked a better question, the one that turned the whole city. What manner of woman, they asked, was this ex-nun who had climbed on a cardinal's bed to her fortune? And was it not said, in the lowest rooms and the oldest, that this same woman had once carried her own newborn son to a church step in the cold of a November night and laid him on the stone and walked away without looking back? Nobody could prove it. That was the genius of the thing. Nobody needed to. The secret she had carried out of the parish entirely alone. The one thing she had been sure no one on earth knew was suddenly in every mouth in Paris, not as a fact, but as a question. And a question cannot be answered, and so can never be killed. A woman who could leave her own child on a stone. Would such a woman blink at a lover's death? The bare little fist against the gray stone, 9 years buried, had been dug up by a hack for hire and set in the window of every print shop on the Pont Neuf. And it damned her more completely than any letter, because it made the murder easy to believe. Everyone always knows, she had once told Ursule. She had been wrong for 9 years. She was not wrong any longer. Inspector Prosper Chalandon came for her on the 3rd day. He was a man of the Châtelet in his middle 40s, plainly dressed, entirely without deference, the sort of officer who had handed great ladies and pickpockets through the same gate with precisely the same face. Rank did not move him. Beauty did not move him. He had seen both fail to be innocent too many times to grant either the courtesy of assuming it. Madame de Tencin. He did not bow more than the law required. You will come with me. There are questions the king's officers must put to you concerning the death of Monsieur de la Fresnaye in this house. I will answer them here. You will answer them at the Châtelet, madame, and after, where you are lodged is not mine to decide. He said it without heat, the way he might have told her the hour. Monsieur l'inspecteur is what you may call me. Your woman may bring you linen. They took her first to the Grand Châtelet, that old dark clot of stone and jurisdiction on the right bank, where the city kept its law and its dead. And then, because her name and the noise of the affair made her no ordinary prisoner, the order came down and they took her east, through the streets and through a gate that closed on greater names than hers, the Bastille. The carriage stopped in the shadow of the towers, and Chalandon handed her down with the same flat courtesy he would have shown a witness or a corpse. And Claudine de Tencin, who had bought her way out of one set of walls with 10 years of a pope's patience, walked in through another set, with a guard at each elbow, and a city behind her that had already decided. The gate did the rest. It always did. What waited within was not the dungeon of the pamphlets, though the pamphlets made much of chains she never wore. A person of her standing held under inquiry and not yet anything at all in law, was lodged in a room with a fire and a chair and a bed, and might have her own woman to wait on her, and food sent in, and the days to think. That was the cruelty of the machinery, and it was a finer cruelty than any rack. It gave her a warm room in which to be utterly disgraced, and time, a great deal of time, in which to feel the city outside deciding her, and no chain at all except the one that mattered, which was that the door did not open from her side. The inquiry itself came down to a table, a fire, and Chalendon. He was patient in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have, because it could not be flattered and could not be tired out. He went over the ground again, and yesterday's ground, and the ground before that. When did Monsieur de la Fresnaye last come to her? What was said? Was money spoken of? He put the fortune to her plainly, that she held it, that the dead man had come to beg it back, that she had refused, and he did not raise his voice when she agreed to every fact of it, because the facts were not in dispute, and he was not a fool who mistook facts for guilt. You do not deny you refused him. I deny nothing that is true, Monsieur l'Inspecteur. I refused him. I had grown poorer in 1 year than you can easily imagine, and I kept what was mine to keep. Men have been refused money before and lived to spend other people's. This one did not live. No. She let the word sit. She did not fill the silence after it because she had learned in a convent choir at 16 that the guilty fill silences and the clever let them lie there. This one did not. The letter was the hinge of it, and the letter in the end was what saved her. Though it had been meant to be the thing that hanged her, it was in his own hand. Chalendon, who had no love for her and no interest in her innocence, was an honest officer of an honest science, and the hand on the fold was the same broken, faltering hand that had signed 100 markers Renancourt himself produced in a rage to prove the debt. A man's own hand laying his own death at a woman's door is a dreadful thing and a damning thing. It is not in law her hand on the pistol. The debt was real, and it was La Fresnaye's, and it was Renancourt's to collect from a dead man's estate and not from a rope around her neck. And slowly, against the whole weight of the city, that plain fact began to hold. And then they questioned Ursule Charnier. This was the true edge of the whole affair, the place where it could have gone into the pit, and no one in Paris knew it but 2 women. Ursule had held the lantern on a November dawn 9 years gone. Ursule had heard La Fresnaye beg and heard Tencin refuse. Ursule had held every secret Claudine de Tencin had ever made, from the stone step to the enameled box to the last cold no in a warm room. And Ursule was a servant, and servants under the king's questions had broken greater houses than this one with a single frightened word. They sat her before Chalendon, and he was gentle with her, which was his cruelty. He had found that the gentle question opened doors, the hard one only bolted. He asked her about the night. He asked her about the fortune. And then, because the pamphlets had done their work, and even an inspecteur reads the sheets on the Pont Neuf, he asked her, quietly, whether it was true what was said of her mistress, that there had once been a child. Ursule Charnier looked at the fire and then at the inspecteur, and she was a woman of the middling sort, who had spent 30 years learning her mistress's one great art, the saying perfectly of a thing one does not mean. My mistress had no child, Monsieur l'Inspecteur, she said. I have been at her side these 30 years, I would know. She held. The wall held. She looked the king's officer in the eye and buried a newborn on a stone step for the second time, this time in words, and her voice did not shake any more than her mistress's ever did, because she had learned from the best in France how a lie is carried without a tremor when everything depends on it. Chalendon looked at her a long moment. Whatever he believed in, he was not a man who believed servants easily. He had no fact, and a question is not a fact, and he let it go. The oldest secret in the story stayed buried under the one witness who could have raised it. In the end, the machinery, which had no heart, did the one thing a heart could not have been trusted to do. It followed the letter and the hand and the plain shape of a ruined man's own despair, and it declined to make of Claudine de Tencin a murderess for the crime of having been loved by a weak man and having refused him his own signed-away money in the coldest year of her life. The inquiry cleared her. After the weeks of it, the door that did not open from her side opened at last, and she walked out of the Bastille a free woman under the law. She was not free of anything else. She walked out into a Paris that had convicted her in every particular the law had failed to prove. And the pamphlets did not stop because a court had, and the one that would never stop, the one that had no answer because it had never been a charge, was the question of the child on the stone. She had survived the reckoning she had seen coming from the moment La Fresnaye went still in her warm room. She had not begun to reckon with the other one. Somewhere across the same city, in the ordinary keeping of ordinary people who had lifted him off a church step 9 winters before, a boy was learning his letters faster than anyone could teach them, and his name was Jean, for the little church he had been left against, and he was hers, and he was growing. 20 years on, the greatest minds in France climbed a staircase on the Rue Saint-Honoré on a Tuesday evening because a woman of no rank had let it be known that Tuesdays were hers. The candles were lit by 5. The chairs were never enough, which was the point, for a room that seats everyone comfortably has admitted too many. And at the center of it, older now, silver at the temple and quicker than ever in the eye, sat Claudine de Tencin, pouring wit and wine in equal measure and calling the assembled genius of the age to their faces her beasts. "My little menagerie," she said, and they laughed, because it was true and because she had earned the right to say it. Fontenelle was there, ancient and dry and delighted. Montesquieu came, who had shaken the thrones of Europe with a book. Marivaux, whose lovers spoke on the stage in a language he had half invented. They came for the supper, which was excellent, and they came for her tongue, which was better, and they came because in these rooms a thing said cleverly on Tuesday was the talk of Paris by Thursday. She had built it herself this time, and out of nothing a man had lent her. That was the sweetness at the bottom of the cup. After the Bastille, after the pamphlets, after a city had convicted her of everything the law let her walk away from, she had not gone back to the old currency of some great protector's bed. She had made her own coin. Her rooms, her table, her judgment, her beasts. A woman who a court had nearly hanged had made herself the hostess of the finest heads in France, and she had done it on her own name, the only thing she had ever truly owned. And she fed them in earnest, which the wits who repeated her cruelties always forgot. A young writer with holes in his coat and nothing in his belly could find, at that table, a place laid, and quietly a purse, and quietly a word dropped to a printer who owed her a favor. She kept men alive who would otherwise have gone under. She had done her sums all her life, and here at last was a ledger she kept generously, feeding the hungry minds of a hungry age from her own hand. The plan she had made in a cold year long before had come out exactly as she drew it. By 1739, her brother was a cardinal, and by the year after, Archbishop of Lyon, lifted the whole distance from an ambitious provincial abbé to a prince of the church by a sister who had never once let go of the rope. She had made herself a novelist besides, and her memoir du Comte de Comminges passed from hand to hand across Europe, wept over by women who had no notion the cool hand that wrote it had ever wept for anything. She had won. By every count the world kept, Claudine de Tencin had won. There was one count the world did not keep, and it was the only one that had ever mattered to her, and it came into her own salon one evening on the lips of her guests. They were speaking that season of a young man, the sharpest new mind in Paris, a mathematician of such clarity that the Academy had already taken him in. A foundling, they said, marvelous story, left as a baby on the steps of the little church by Notre Dame, Saint-Jean-le-Rond, and named for it. Raised by a glazier's wife over on the far side, one Madame Rousseau, who took him off the step and loved him as her own. Jean Laurent d'Alembert. One heard he would remake the whole map of human knowledge. He and Diderot, this great encyclopedia they were building. A pity about the birth. Someone had simply thrown him away. Tencin's face did not change. It never changed. That had been held against her for 30 years by people who thought grief owed the room a performance. She sat in her own bright salon among her beasts, and she understood, in the space of a sentence dropped by a man reaching for a sweetmeat, that the child on the stone was the young genius all Paris was toasting, and that he was hers. and that he bore the name of the church and the name of the glazier's wife, and no name at all of her own. She had kept the number all these years. In an enameled box among her rings, there was still the scrap, the ticket number by which a mother who mended her fortune might once have gone to a clerk and named a child and taken him back. She had mended her fortune past all dreaming. She did not need the number now. His name was in every mouth in the room, and none of them knew they were saying her secret aloud. And she sat there and did her sums one final time, and they did not come out, and they were never going to come out, and she had known that on a stone step in the cold before the bells, and she knew it now with his triumph ringing off her own walls. She said something dry about mathematicians and their manners, and the table laughed, and the evening went on. She sent for him at the very end, not before, not in the 30 years she had watched him rise, not when she passed the little church and had only to speak to a clerk. Not once in all that time did Claudine de Tencin do the things she might have done. Only when she was old and 67 and dying in the last month of 1749, only then, with nothing left to lose that the world had not already taken, or that she was not about to leave regardless, did she at last reach back for the small, bare fist she had laid on the gray stone. The tale that came down, and it is a tale, thinly sourced and much repeated, and too neat to trust entirely, says that she sent word to him, and that he came. That she told him from the bed what she had never told a living soul but Ursule, that she was his mother, that the stone step in the November cold had been hers, and that she wished, now, at the close, to own him, to have him, to take back across a deathbed the things she had set down 32 years before. And he is remembered to have refused her, quietly, without a raised voice and without revenge, which made it final in a way that fury never could have. He is remembered to have told her that he already had a mother, that his mother was Madame Rousseau, the glazier's wife, the woman who had lifted him off the cold and warmed him and raised him, and never once in his life turned her back and walked into the dark. That woman was his mother, he said. He knew no other, and he wished none. And he kept his name, the church's name, the foundling's name, the name she had not troubled to give him, and he gave her nothing across that deathbed but the plain fact of what she had chosen, handed back to her at last with her own coldness in it. So the question that hung over her whole life was answered, and the answer was the cruelest arithmetic of all. Yes, in the end she tried to take him back, and no, he did not let her. If this history has found you here, in the small hours, among the other stories this channel tells of the women the court used and the court buried, then stay a while and subscribe and let the rest of them be told. Claudine de Tencin died on the 4th of December, 1749, in her rooms on the Rue Saint-Honoré, a celebrated woman. Read across Europe, sister to a cardinal, the maker in her own salon of the minds that were even then writing the great book that would light the century, her own abandoned son among its architects. She was, by every account the world troubled to keep, a triumph. She was not, by the single account she had spent her last breath trying to balance, a mother. And that account she carried out of the world exactly as unpaid as she had carried it in. Ursule Charnier, who had held the lantern and held the silence and held the wall at the Bastille, closed her mistress's eyes. She had kept the one secret for 32 years, and she kept it still. And what became of the number in the enameled box among the rings, whether it was buried with her or quietly burned, no one troubled to write down, because no one but 2 old women had ever known it was there. Everyone always knows, she had liked to say, in the years when she still believed the world could be counted. She had been wrong. The one thing that mattered, the world never knew, because she buried it herself on a cold morning and paid a lifetime to keep it buried, and the paying was the whole of her punishment, and she chose it freely every single day. Go back, then, to the beginning, to the freezing dawn and the little church crouched against the great one, and the woman kneeling to set a bundle on the stone. She draws the cloth back once to look at the small, sleeping face. One tiny hand has worked free of the wrapping, a bare fist open against the gray stone, and she cannot make herself cover it, and she does not ask herself why. She rises, she turns. She walks into the dark of the street, and everything she will ever build, the salon and the cardinal and the novels and the glittering rain, all of it, every candle of it, is only the long echo of the sound that hand did not make when she did not pick it up. She left her son on a stone to buy a life, and the life was magnificent, and it was never once worth the stone.